From August 1 to September 24, 1944, on July 28, 1944, General Patton was given command of the Third Army, which had already landed in Europe. The First Army began its advance on Saint-Lô on July 26. The offensive continued to gain momentum in the following days. It reached a climax when, on August 1, General Patton, like a thunderclap, burst with his Third Army into the Breton Peninsula. Within 2 weeks, units of the Third Army cleared Brittany of German troops, pursuing the fleeing enemy to Lorient and Brest. Third Army units liberated territories down the Loire as far as Angers, and in their eastward movements splashed beyond the borders of Le Mans and Alep. By the end of August, when the German units still remained in some port cities of Brittany, the pressure of the offensive of the Third Army reached its peak. Parts of it, bypassing Paris, reached Reims, Verdun and Commercy. No later than September 5, parts of the Third Army were at Metz and Pont-à-Mousson, and September 15. Units of the 12th and 20th Corps of its composition went to the Moselle River, and in some areas even crossed it. The plans of the High Command confused Patton's maps and stopped the victorious march of the Third Army. Shortages of fuel, ammunition, and everything else constrained its forces and prevented the commander from developing the initiative. By the time this phase of the campaign ended on September 25, the Third Army had cleared the enemy from the west bank of the Moselle River north of Metz and was firmly in position east of it. The towns of Luneville and Rambertville were firmly held by Third Army forces. During the period of time described in this chapter, the 7th American Army successfully landed in southern France. It rushed boldly and decisively to meet the Third Army units. The rendezvous of the two armies took place on September 11 north of Dijon. The 1st American Army and the 2nd British Army moved on parallel tracks through northern France. In the early days of September, they reached the border with Belgium and captured Antwerp, and now Russian and Romanian units crossed Bulgaria, and the Russians began a new offensive south of East Prussia. The American 9th Army was formed already on the continent, and took over to complete the Third Army's initial liberation of the ports of Brittany from the German troops entrenched there. The American and British air forces continued to support the ground forces with constant bombing raids on the Riche's territory far from the front line. At the end of this period of success, the British carried out an unsuccessful landing at Arnhem. The First Army was breaking its teeth on the impregnable Siegfried Line near Aachen. The 9th Army gradually completed the clearing of the Germans from Brittany, but still could not dislodge them from Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. The 7th Army, having cleared Epinal, was approaching Troyes-de-Belfort. When in March, April and May 1944, I was at the headquarters of the 3rd United States Army in England, I gradually strengthened the idea that the army should make a landing either on the Cherbourg Peninsula or somewhere in the vicinity of Calais. Personally, the second option seemed more attractive to me, although the operation in this area of enemy defences could be expensive at first, but in the next stages we would pay a much lower price. When the army landed from the sea on amphibious ships, you must choose a point as close as possible to the object. Calais was closer to the target than Cherbourg. While thinking over the possible variants of events, I noted the milestones that seemed to me to be fateful on our way, the places of future decisive battles with the enemy. Thus I told Mr. J.J. McCloy, Under-Secretary of Defence, when he came to visit us in England, that the first major clash of the Third Army with the enemy will be in the area of Rennes. It turned out, however, that battle was the second. I also noted Laval, Chateaubriand, Nantes, Angers, Tours, Orleans, and Bourges and Nevers, as I felt at the time that we should move south of the Laurier Bend. I still haven't decided whether we did the right thing in not doing exactly that. There were battles at many of the other points I noted later on, but since I don't have my map with me now, I can't name them all. What I do remember is that I marked Chartres and Troyes, and oddly enough, Worms and Marnes. Interestingly, I oriented myself on the map of highways with a scale of 1 million, and if, as they say, one man is a model of all mankind, then the best basis for planning a campaign than the network of highways cannot think of. I think for high commanders, maps with a scale of 1,000,000 are just the right thing. Because a commander has to make global decisions about which transportation arteries to cross, which major population centers to capture, in order to inflict the most damage on the enemy. How to capture these cities and roads is no longer our business. This should be handled by the commanders of the next echelon, oriented by maps on a larger scale, or better, making decisions by studying the territory on the spot. I've also been reading Freeman's Normandy invasion. Freeman carefully noting which roads William the Conqueror used in Normandy and Brittany. The use of these roads, even in modern conditions, allows you to bypass the enemy and avoid the traps prepared by him. On July 6, a 10.25-hour plane left the ground, and the shores of the United Kingdom were left behind us. It was exactly 1 year after we left Algeria to land in Sicily. As we flew over the peninsula where Cherbourg was located, we saw a great number of disabled ships close to the shore. As we landed and motored along the shore, the sight of the wrecked ships was disconcerting to me. Of course, only a fraction of them had suffered from the enemy's fire. Much more damage had been done to us by the storm that raged immediately after the operation began. The shore fortifications, especially the pillboxes, were impressive. The fact that under all these factors, the Allies were able to successfully carry out the landing says that a well-prepared army can fulfill the tasks in any conditions. From the shore we drove to General Bradley's headquarters south of Isigny, where I spent the first night to the sound of the most intense cannonade I had ever heard in my life. Our troops were engaged in an artillery preparation, and Bradley's headquarters was placed just adjacent to the artillery corps, and was, moreover, surrounded on all sides by divisional batteries. The next day we drove to our first command post on the continent at Meuse, south of Brickbeck. Brickbeck Castle is believed to have belonged to one of Julius Caesar's associates. Interestingly, the donjon of the castle has 11 corners. Its architecture reflects the process of transformation of an early quadrangular tower into a round tower. On the way to the command post, we passed over the bridge at Carantana, which it was thought could be shot at by the enemy. We therefore proceeded at a very high speed, keeping considerable intervals between vehicles. What was my surprise when I saw 4 of our boys fishing on that very bridge. None of the important guests, however, denied themselves the pleasure of later mentioning the danger of passing the bridge. Thanks to the exertions of General Gay, who had taken great pains to arrange everything as it should be. Our command post was located in an orchard among the apple trees. While there, I gave myself the trouble to survey the German lines of defence around Cherbourg, both from the ground and from the air. I assumed that the Germans, as a people methodical and consistent, would not create anything unexpected, something we had not seen from them before. My observations convinced me that the enemy's defensive lines were not so impregnable, and practice proved the validity of my judgment. The entire northern tip of the Cherbourg Peninsula was covered with launchers for Far-1 missiles. Pretty interesting things. Usually a concrete branch off the main road was built and camouflaged with earth and dust. The branch ended with a concrete pad or perimeter the size of 2 tennis courts, at the edge of which trucks could stop. Closer to the center of the perimeter there were several openings. Some of the pads had recesses for storing the missiles, some did not. The procedure for launching the Feihu-1 was as follows. At night, trucks arrived, bringing missiles and a collapsible trestle, the booms of which were installed in the above-mentioned recesses, so that the structure had an angle of inclination of about 30 degrees from the ground. Each such trestle looked in some strictly defined direction, and the missile launched from it flew to a predetermined target. When the ammunition ran out, all the equipment was packed up and taken away. Some were left behind to camouflage the perimeter. This was very successful because of the many such sites I visited. Only a few were seriously damaged by airstrikes. We came across another huge structure of unknown purpose. As far as I know, no one has ever realized what it was for. It consisted of a concrete strip 1.5 kilometers long and 20 to 25 meters wide, connecting 2 embankments. On each side there were concreted cone-shaped depressions about 30 meters deep and 50 to 60 meters wide at the top. It seems to me that more material was used for the construction of this structure than for the construction of the Pyramid of Cheops. No less than 3,000 campers worked on its erection. But, to all appearances, the construction was not completed even to the middle. July 12, General Roosevelt died, and while we said goodbye to him in the cemetery in Saint-Ouen, our anti-aircraft guns, firing at German planes as if saluting in honour of a brave soldier, which was Teddy. On the 17th, we were visited by Secretary of Defence Stimson with General Searles, Mr. Bandier. On the 24th, Colonel Flint died, and on the 26th, we buried General McNair. Paddy would have loved the way his funeral was arranged. We ordered a special coffin for him and put it on an all-terrain vehicle, which carried the coffin to the place of burial. He was carried to the grave by the Army commander, 3 corps commanders, the Army Chief of Staff and his deputy, and all the staff who were free at that moment. The funeral of General McNair, on the contrary, was for reasons of security very modest. Only Bradley, Hodges, Cressida and myself were present. General Henry visited me on the evening of the 24th, and we spent a pleasant time inspecting the launching pads for the Far One and talking with the soldiers of the 6th Armoured Division. My first Sunday in Normandy was quite impressive. I attended a Catholic Mass that was celebrated by a priest in the field. During the service we were all in arms, and as we knelt kneeling on the spreading ground under a drizzle, guns rumbled in the distance and the sky was teeming with airplanes rising from their pads to kill, to do just what our religion forbids. I always remember the time spent in the apple orchard with some distaste, because I kept thinking that the war would be over before it really began for me. I was also sure that if we tried harder we could advance faster. I have repeatedly stated, and now also remain true to this opinion, that massive artillery preparation, the use of shells with non-contact fuses, would have allowed us to break through the enemy's defences in the area of Avranches and ensure a faster development of events in the western direction with only 2 tank and 2 infantry divisions and without having to wait for massive bombardment for air. My confidence that events could develop in this way was only strengthened when the guys from the 3rd Armoured Division installed on the tanks their invented anti-fence scoops. These were subsequently perfected by Colonel Nixon. The fact that the Cherbourg Peninsula and a fair part of eastern Brittany are covered with the so-called bocage, small fields surrounded by embankments from 1.5 to 2 meters high with hedges on them. This created problems for infantry advance, but the tank scoops could easily penetrate the obstacle like a spoon into warm butter. We were guided by crosses at road junctions, used by our communicators as additional telephone poles. Although the crosses were neither cold nor hot from such treatment, still somehow it became uncomfortable at the thought that they involuntarily turned into conductors of death. After all, orders to kill were sent through the wires. Before the Third Army went into action at noon on August 1, July 28, General Bradley by verbal order appointed me its commander and revealed to me his plan, which was to employ 2 corps in the initial stage, the 8th Corps of Middleton on the right flank and the 15th Corps of Haslip on the left. The rest of the Third Army, consisting of the 12th Corps and the 20th Corps, was not at that stage ready to fight. In accordance with our plans, on the 29th I went to rendezvous with the troops near Coutances and found the guys from the Armoured Division chilling on the road. Meanwhile their staffers, safely camouflaged in a house behind the church, were up to their necks studying maps. I inquired why they had not crossed the river. They replied that they were studying the matter but could not find a suitable place. I asked how long they had been preoccupied with this problem, and they said that they had looked all over the map, but had not found anything. Then I told them a secret. I told them that I had crossed this river, and the depth of water in it is only 0.5 meter, and the only obstacle to their iron armada will be one enemy machine gunner, who, judging by the fact that he could not hit me, cannot shoot at all. I repeated the proverb that the Japanese are very fond of: it is better to see once than to hear 100 times, and then asked them why the hell they were sitting here at headquarters instead of going out and getting their feet a little wet. The lesson went in the boys' favour, and from then on they acted in such a way that nothing but good things I could say about them. On the morning of July 31st, we moved our command post north of the Granville-Saint-Sever Lane Road. Here Willie had a stormy affair with a Frenchwoman's dog and dug up the remains of a recently buried German soldier. Gaffey, Gay and I stayed at the old command post until 3:45 p.m, and for good reason, as we managed to contact 3 cavalry units that we needed badly. After dinner, Gaffey and I drove to the 8th Corps command post at Briel. When Middleton saw us, he was overjoyed, as he had just accomplished his objective of reaching the Saloon River. Now he did not know what he should do next. I told Middleton that history is replete with battles lost just because someone failed to ford a river in time. In short, I ordered him to cross immediately. While we were discussing with Middleton the possibilities of crossing the Saloon by a bridge near Pontaubeu, the telephone rang and we were informed that the very bridge we had been talking about, though damaged, was still suitable for crossing. I regarded this news, which came so timely, as a sign from above, a guarantee of future success for the Third Army. We also learned that the 4th Armoured Division had captured the causeway east of the bridge, which was also quite suitable as a crossing point, and had taken 4,000 prisoners. Having received this information, I ordered Middleton to immediately advance with the 6th Armoured and 79th Infantry Divisions to Brest and the 8th Infantry and 4th Armoured Divisions to Rennes, and to form a shock corps under General L. Ernst to advance along the northern coast of the peninsula. On the way back to headquarters, I saw the bodies of dead Germans. Let me say that one of them was a dead man. Deader than dead. Never before had I met such a one. He was half lying or half sitting under a hedge in full uniform, with a helmet on his head and even its strap under his chin. At the same time, the German was completely black. Never once had I seen corpses look like that. On the morning of August 1, everyone in our camp was absorbed in a flurry of activity, all except Harkins and me. So at noon he and I decided to have a little drink to celebrate the birth of the Third Army. All we could get was a bottle of brandy of dubious quality, which Harkins had been given by Campanile. We took a sip from that bottle and almost choked on it. The passage of 2 army corps through avalanches was an impossible thing, but the corps got through. The task was accomplished only thanks to the active help of veterans from the division headquarters and the efforts of its commander, who personally chose the direction and controlled every step of his guys. It is obvious to me that if there had been a traffic jam, our losses, especially those of the motorized infantry, would have been monstrous. I understood this perfectly well even when I gave the order, and I kept repeating to myself, my own fear and apprehension is the worst adviser. Never take your own fears as counsellors. The first and foremost task of the Third Army was to seize and hold the position across the Saloon River between Avranches and Saint-Hilaire-d'Arcou. I believed that the best and most correct way to ensure the fulfillment of the task would be through the immediate seizure of Brest and Lorient, and undertook to carry out this mission. By the evening of August 1, the 6th Armoured Division had captured Pontaison, where Beatrice and I had spent one night in 1913 when we went to Mont Saint-Michel. During the operation, the division lost a battery of self-propelled guns purely through stupidity. The guns had moved too far to the front line, and they were placed impermissibly close to each other, and the escort unit was absent. Unfortunately, the officer responsible for the incident was killed in action. On the same day, the 4th Armoured was near Rennes, where a funny thing happened. About an hour before sunset, we received a report of a fast-advancing enemy tank column southwest of Rennes. I asked the commander of the 19th Tactical Air Brigade, General Wayland, to send our attack aircraft against those tanks. After a while, I was reported that the pilots cannot detect the enemy tanks. Soon, however, it became clear that it was none other than a column of the 4th Panzer, advancing to Rennes from the northeast. But since the attack aircraft flew there, they cleared the way for our tanks, bombing the enemy positions in the direction of the 4th Division. In general, this episode was the first in a chain of many similar ones that took place later. Between the Third Army and the 19th Tactical Air Brigade was love at first sight. On August 2, Stiller and I joined the 90th Division columns on the march eastward from Avranches and followed them for some time. By this time, the success of this division seemed very, very doubtful, but it had already come under the command of General Maclean and General Weaver. When we reached the point where the road turned south to Saint-Hilaire, I met Maclean and Haslip, and learned from them that Weaver was fighting further down the road for possession of the bridge. Such was the birth of one of the finest military units. The 90th became through the efforts of these two men. Subsequently, the division was also lucky enough to be led by other fine commanders. On our way back to headquarters, Haslip and I saw a young officer jump out of a jeep and rush into the ditch with his soldiers. I drove closer and asked what had happened. I was told that there was a German airplane in the sky above us. I looked up and indeed saw an airplane. However, it was very high up and could not harm us. I could feel that the guys were new and this was their first battle, so they were very nervous. Realizing that they were worried for nothing and afraid that I might think them cowards, they rushed back to their car with even more speed than they had jumped out of it. Returning from Avranches, I witnessed the most horrible accident I have ever witnessed. A soldier from an engineer unit fell off a bulldozer, and the machine ran over him, literally cutting his body lengthwise in half. However, the guy was still alive, and until the medics arrived, I gave him morphine. In those days, the Germans made air raids on us quite often, although in comparison with the hell we were giving them, we could say that they did not bomb us at all. One night they dropped at least 100 bombs in less than an hour. I counted the explosions. Of course, the very fact that I could hear them separately spoke of the scattered nature of the bombing. On another night, the Germans took their time. They took proper aim and bombed their own soldiers who had been taken prisoner by us and put under lock and key. The chief of military police released the prisoners, and of the several thousand, with the exception of 50 men, all returned. The returnees were indignant at what their countrymen had done and spoke very freely of it. On the 4th Codman and Stiller, and I decided to go in search of the 6th Armoured Division. Stiller rode ahead in an armoured car, and Codman and I followed him in a jeep through Avranches, Pontorson, Combourg and Merdrignac. On the way we met a liaison officer who looked very frightened and assured us that the road was being shot at by the enemy. Later we realized that the guy was a little out of his mind. Nevertheless, to drive along a 15-kilometre stretch of road, which is considered to be not yet taken from the enemy and not to see any of our own, was worth our nerves. At last we came upon the command post of the division, and all the excitement was left behind us. The next day I found out with great amazement that those yesterday's 15 kilometres we drove right through the positions of the German division. I did not tell my chief of intelligence that I did not find any German division there. As we moved deeper into Brittany, the local population's attitude towards us improved. I think it was because there was less fighting and no heavy bombing. The Normans on the Cherbourg Peninsula did not feel much sympathy for us. We and the Germans were all bombing their towns. Since I had to travel long distances, I tried to travel more by air on the L5 communications plane, from which I saw many crashed planes. A strange and almost mystical sight. They reminded me of bug-eaten dead birds. Gliders with big heavy noses looked like dragonflies. Once on a trip to the 12th Army Group, General Bradley's headquarters, I visited St. Lo, where Beatrice and I had stayed in 1913 and bought some furniture. Those were the halcyon days before the war. On my current trip, the city was frightening to look at. There seemed to be nowhere else on earth with so many ruined buildings. At any rate, I'd never seen anything like it before. Then I saw more. On August 7, the Germans decided to bring down on us the full force of their bomber aviation. However, they dropped mostly small bombs weighing no more than 100 kilograms and light fragmentation bombs. During this operation, they bombed one of our warehouses, where they stored at least 1,000 tons of various ammunition. 3 days passed, and they were still exploding. On the 7th, Ratikis, already at the beginning of the second week, The 83rd Division of the 8th Corps went to the outskirts of Saint-Malo. The 6th Armoured was near Brest, but unfortunately not in Brest. Dinard was captured by a mobile infantry unit of the 8th Division, which continued to advance across the peninsula west of Saint-Malo to strike Dinard. The 4th Armoured Division was at Vannes and approaching Lorient. The 79th crossed the river near Laval, and the 90th near Mayenne. Meanwhile, the 5th Armoured had almost reached Chateau-Gontier, and scout units of the same 8th Division were all in Chateaubriand. At 831 American pilot, shot down on the outskirts of Angers but rescued by a Frenchman from the interior, appeared to us. He told us that all the way from Angers to Chateaubriand, he had not encountered a single large unit of German troops, with the exception of a corps of signalmen, laying a telephone line and moving in an easterly direction. In addition, the pilot assured us that the bridge at Angers had survived. I sent General Gaffey, French, and Staff Lieutenant Colonel Caterevi Vitry to set up an assault force of units of the 5th Infantry Division, several tanks, and scout units to immediately advance and take Angers. Of course, the operation could have been quite risky, but war is war. This time the guys risked not in vain. The suddenness of their appearance played a favourable role, although the Germans still managed to blow up the bridge right in front of their noses. Later that day we heard rumours that the Germans were concentrating their units on the line Morton, Barantony preparing an attack on Avranches by several armoured divisions. Personally, I thought that the enemy was bluffing, hoping only to ensure their retreat. Nevertheless, I ordered the 80th and 35th Divisions to halt their advance, and also sent a warning to the French 2nd Armoured Division, located in the vicinity of Saint-Hilaire, so that they would be prepared for a possible enemy attack. On the 8th, Houzomet and I went by car to Dole, where it was believed that the largest phallic symbol in the world was to be located. We did not, however, find this object and went to see the 8th Corps, and then proceeded on to the vicinity of Saint-Malo, which was being stormed by the 83rd Division. Its commander, Macon, I found in the front ranks of the attackers. When he saw me and General Hughes in the car, he literally turned white, apparently thinking that I came to remove him from the command of the division. Realizing what he was afraid of, I shout, "Everything is fine. Everything is fine." In fact, the division deserved only a good mark. Excellent to them at that moment, I could not put them. They had taken 1,300 prisoners, but they had already lost 800 men themselves. On the same day, we ordered the 15th Corps to launch an attack on the enemy's defensive orders on the line Alençon, CC. On the 8th, St. Malo fell under the blows of the 83rd Division, while the 5th suppressed the last pockets of enemy resistance in Angers. General Spatz Tedder and Bradley arrived at headquarters. It was the first time we had all been together since Gafsa. It was on that very day that the Germans had bombed Main Street, not on a black night but on a white day, although Spayats assured me that the skies were under complete British control. I swear Patton has made a special arrangement with the Germans. They are acting in his spirit. I assured him that with the Germans did not negotiate, but if I met the commander of the enemy squadron, I would consider it my duty to reward him. He deserved it, if only for giving us a good opportunity to see how fast the Arabs and their camels could run. I was increasingly concerned about the gap in the flank of the American army between Saint-Hilaire and Mayenne, and a second one southwest of Alençon. The only way to patch the gaps was to concentrate the 8th Armoured's forces at Fugères. On the 11th, Codman and I visited the headquarters of the 15th Corps northeast of Le Mans, then the 79th and 90th Infantry and 5th Armoured Divisions. I was unable to locate General Leclerc of the 2nd French Armoured Division as he was touring the front, in spite of the fact that I followed Leclerc farther than the security measures prescribed. I never met him. The day before, French and our tankers from the 5th Division had engaged in heavy fighting with the enemy, losing 40 vehicles. During my trip, a funny incident occurred. I always demanded that the anti-tank guns are covertly installed at points from which the calculation would have a good view of the terrain, remaining until the very last moment invisible to the enemy. Here at the crossroads of 3 roads, near the cross, stood an unmasked gun. I gave the sergeant in charge a good thrashing for not following my orders. When I finished, the sergeant said, "Yes, sir, but yesterday we took out 2 German tanks from this very position." I had to apologize to him. What happened? Maybe the sanctity of the place protected our cannon. We worked out a plan according to which the 7th Armoured Division was to cross the Mayenne River in the Mayenne area and go to Alençon, while the 80th Division would move north to join the 7th on the road Laval-Lem. Once the 1st Army units were in range of the 35th Division, the latter could be released to then combine all these divisions to form the 20th Corps, which would then be placed to the left of the 15th Corps. The 5th Infantry Division, with the exception of the Assault Brigade still at Angers, will concentrate at Le Mans, and as soon as the 4th Armoured is released will join it. The above 2 divisions will form the 13th Corps, ready to march northeast, or, in other words, will operate south of the 15th Corps on the right flank of the army. The Germans, encamped on the islands near St. Malo, were still firing long-range guns at our units concentrated ashore, and no matter how hard I tried to get the British Navy to resolve this problem, so far everything remained the same. We also decided to ask for air support against Dinard, as we were taking unnecessarily heavy casualties due to our efforts to avoid bombing the cities. On the way to our new command post, located 10 kilometers northwest of Le Mans, Codman and I stopped at Chateau Fougueres. From a military point of view, it was the best castle I had ever seen in my life, because the civilian population there had been absent since the time of Richelieu, who ordered the destruction of residential buildings and the conversion of the fortress for purely military purposes. In the entire history of the castle, it has only been stormed twice, the first time around 1100 and the second time now. On the 13th, it became quite clear that we had no use for the 20th Corps, so we moved the 7th Armoured and 5th Infantry Divisions to the northeast of Le Mans, sending the Assault Brigade of the 80th Division to Angers. This allowed us to form the 12th Corps from the 4th Armoured and 35th Infantry Divisions. The 15th Corps, consisting, as before, of the 5th Armoured, the 2nd French Armoured, and the 90th and 79th Infantry, occupied the line Alençon-Essaye-Jantan. Our units could easily have entered Falaise and completely closed the hole in the flank, but we were ordered not to do so, ostensibly because the British had dropped a large number of time bombs here. This stoppage was a great mistake on the part of the High Command, for I am sure that we could have taken Falaise, and I am not at all sure that such a task was within the power of the British. As a matter of fact, when we received the order to fall back, our scouts had already come very close to the town. Because of the forced halt of the 15th Corps, the 20th Corps moved to Drie and the 12th Corps to Chartres. Regrouped in this way, the army, which consisted of 4 corps, could advance in any direction without interference, which it actually did on the 12th and 13th and later, thanks to the talents of Colonel Cummings, adjutant. The system of command of the Third Army was so arranged as to enable the army commanders to manipulate the divisions directly, while leaving the corps the legitimate functions of tactical units in their area of operations. As a consequence of this organization, we could easily replace divisions when we needed to without wasting time or losing the initiative. We never had to regroup, which seems to have become a favorite pastime of army commanders with the British. By August 14, the Third Army had advanced further and continued to advance faster than any other army in history. The night of the 14th was the first time since the beginning of the operation that the Germans had not bombed us, but in the morning we were raided by an off-course American bomber. Codman and I flew to Le Mans. I can't remember a time when I've ever been more reluctant to board an aircraft. The fact is that literally everyone at headquarters assured me that if we do not shoot down the German planes, it will do the American anti-aircraft gunners, who have recently become, because of the constant bombing, very sensitive to any aircraft over their heads. That was one of the few days in my life when I felt a real threat of death. Fortunately, it was all right. We landed near the road and immediately stopped a passing medical jeep. However, before getting into it, I asked to remove the flag with the Red Cross, as I did not want to drive under a foreign banner, hiding behind the emblem of an organization whose mission is not to kill, but to save from death. After seeing McLean at the 90th Division, we went to the headquarters of the 15th Corps to orient Haslip in the situation. He agreed with me as to the fact that with 2 divisions he could march on Drouex, and with the other 2 cover the Falaise window in our defences. Later I met with Bradley, and he approved our plan, in consequence of which the 15th Corps marched on Drouex, the 20th on Chartres, and the 12th on Orleans. He also authorised me to take and use the 80th Division for the march eastward, filling its place in the 8th Corps with a division from the 1st Army, the number of units in which was thus reduced. As a result, by the end of the day the situation looked as follows. 3 corps were to begin the offensive eastward at 20.30, and the 8th Corps had the task of finishing off the Germans in Brittany, just east of Le Mans. I saw an example of excellent interaction between air and ground units. For 3 or even 4 kilometres on the road was full of enemy vehicles. Trucks and armoured vehicles, bearing the brand marks left to them by machine guns of P-47 attack aircraft. Traces of 50 caliber bullets were also visible on the asphalt. When tanks and airplanes work in concert, the results are always excellent. Tanks are able to move fast enough to give the enemy no time to move off the road and turn around. And if he stays in column, there is no worse trouble than the attacking planes can bring him. To achieve the best possible cooperation, 2 things are necessary. First, a trusting and fraternal attitude to each other, representatives of different branches of the troops. In this case, tanks and aviation. The second is the rapid, demanding extreme tension of forces advance of ground units. Commanders should not be afraid to shed an extra drop of sweat, because these drops save a lot of soldiers' blood. Fighting spirit grew even in hospitals, and cases of war fatigue and self-shooting went down sharply. Soldiers always like to play for the team that wins. I was visited by an extremely upset General Leclerc, who pointed out to me that his boys in the 90th Division were idle, while the 79th Infantry was advancing on Dreux. I explained to him that this was done to maximize the impact of the use of military force, and that I did not care at all about who would be the first to cross the Seine or what political fallout it would cause. In spite of the fact that I had to be harsh at the beginning of the conversation, General Leclerc and I parted as friends. Again, we were frightened of 5 armoured divisions, concentrated in the area of Argentan, and I received orders to stop the advance of the 3rd Army units on the line Drouex-Châteaudun. One way or another, I managed to convince the High Command that it is necessary to continue the offensive. That's what I did the next morning. On the 15th, Prince Felixis of Luxembourg arrived. On the 16th, Stiller, Codman, and myself went to Chartres, which had just been taken by Walker. We met him at the bridge, which was still being shot at by the enemy. The bridge appeared to have been partially destroyed by a German hiding in cover. When the advance parties entered the bridge, the German closed the chain, and several of our soldiers were killed by the explosion. Then the perpetrator of their deaths crawled out of his hiding place and surrendered. Ours had the folly to take him prisoner. At Chartres, we proceeded to the headquarters of the 15th Corps at Châteauneuf-en-Thimer. General Haslip was in a bad mood because of the incident with the French truck, but the morale of his boys was at a high level. At 6 p.m. on the 16th, Bradley called and ordered me to use the forces of the 2nd French Armoured and the 90th and 80th Divisions to storm and capture Rennes, located in the Falaise window. He also told me that General Guéraud, whose 5th Corps in the 1st Army had been plucked by taking divisions from him to attack Brest with the 8th Corps of my army, would lead these units as corps commander. Bradley also informed me that Guéraud would make another attempt to take the Rennes. I immediately sent Gaffey to Anson to carry out Bradley's orders and storm the Rennes, and since Bradley had called me to him, I arranged with Gay that if the command decided to substitute Gaffey for Guéraud, I would telephone Gay, change horses, and name a time to start the attack. The next morning I learned that Guéraud and his staff officers had arrived at 3rd Army headquarters. I called Gay and gave him what I think is the shortest order ever given to a corps as command. Change horses at 600. As compensation for the 3 divisions taken from us. We received 2 divisions taken from the First Army, plus 2 battalions of Rangers. At the same time, I told Haslip to attack Montgomery with the 5th Armoured and 79th Infantry Divisions. Having taken possession of this settlement, we could take control of the movement of German ships on the Seine. August 17. A very sad incident occurred. Because of a circulatory disorder, seriously ill Major General Gilbert Cook, who commanded the 12th Corps and served as deputy commander of the army during the landing in Europe. He was no longer able to perform his duties, which was a great blow to both of us, and I was not immediately able to come to terms with the doctor's verdict. Cook was and remains a fearless soldier and a fine commander. He never left his post as long as his failing health permitted. On the 19th, I asked Major General Manton C. Eddy to replace Cook and take command of the 12th Corps. Eddy had commanded the 9th Division in Tunisia and Sicily during the Channel crossing and landing on the continent. Colonel Odem was wounded by a sniper's bullet while passing through the same woods I passed through on the 16th. He was going up to his jeep and had not yet had time to get in when he felt something hit him above his heart, and only then heard the shot. He touched the spot where the bullet had hit and saw that his hand was covered in blood. As soon as the chauffeur realized what had happened, he shouted, "We've got to get out of here." He turned the car so vigorously that Odem almost flew out of it. The bullet struck a rib and went sideways, missing a lung. If it hadn't, Odem would have died. Disregarding the advice of his colleagues, he returned to duty 3 days after being wounded. The Sicilian campaign ended exactly 1 year ago, on the 17th. On the 19th, with General Weich commanding the 79th Division, we marched out to Mantoue and saw the Seine. I could hardly resist the temptation to give the order to cross the river, but did not do so without consulting General Bradley. After a tedious flight, during which we turned back twice on account of bad weather, I finally reached my objective. Bradley not only approved my plan of crossing the Seine by units of the 79th, but also ordered the 5th Armoured of the same corps to begin an offensive northward along the west bank of the river, while the 19th Corps of the 1st Army under Major General S. Corlett was to follow in its rear on the left flank. And, moreover, Bradley authorized the execution of the plan I had suggested, by which the 19th Corps would cross in the vicinity of Melun and Fontainebleau, and the 12th Corps at Sansa. It was becoming evident that if our units were able to safely cross to the other side, and Seine and Yonne will lose their appeal to the Germans as strategic sites. The Menon crossing was similar to that made by Labienso with his 10th Legion about 55 BC. Colonel Coetman went to Vannes and returned from there with my old friend General Coechlin Schwartz of the French army. He had been one of the chief instructors at the Academy for senior staff officers at Langres during World War I. We had a pleasant time reminiscing about old times. By the way, the general confided to me that if he had not only adopted my methodology at Langres, but had merely suggested that it was possible to act as I did, he would have been immediately committed to a madhouse. He also stated that when he heard about the advance of the tank division to Brest, he thought that I was in command. I asked him why he thought that in 1940 the French army was so ill-prepared for war. He replied that even 10 years before the Germans invaded, the French military had begun to learn only one thing: how to defend but not how to attack. On the 20th, one assault brigade of the 79th Division of the 15th Corps forced the Seine near Mantes. At the same time, the 5th Armoured Division of the same corps moved north, attacking Louviers. As it was clearing the enemy from Yves-Ruex, German tanks hit it from the left in the rear. The 7th Armoured, which was in Yves-Ruex at the time, came to its aid, and the Germans retreated, losing 10 tanks. Nevertheless, this clash slowed the advance of the 5th Armoured. Implementing the plans worked out as early as the 20th, I set the time of the beginning of the offensive of the 20th and 12th Corps, respectively, in Melun, Montreuil, and Sansa at dawn, the next morning, August 21, so that no one would have time to stop me. However, for backup, I did arrange with the corps commanders for a code word, prepositioning, sounded for them on the radio wave. It was supposed to mean, stand in. At such moments, I always had a strange, maybe even funny feeling. When the plans were in my head, everything seemed simple. But after I gave the orders and they started to be put into action, I, realizing that nothing could be changed, began to worry. My own fear and apprehension are the worst counselors. These feelings were similar to those I had when I was participating in steeplechase. I was always very nervous before a race, and when the bell rang, signifying that it was time to get in the saddle, I was afraid. But as soon as the bell was rung and the race started, the fear left me instantly. When this time I gave the signal and the race began, Eddie, the commander of the 12th Corps, asked me if he had to worry about the state of affairs on the right flank. I replied that it depended on his natural inclinations, that is, whether he was a very nervous man or not. Of course, we had nothing to cover the right flank, but the attack echelon, that is, division by division, could negate the factor of lack of cover. If I had always worried about the flanks, I would never have won a single battle. In addition, I had no doubt that our pilots will detect any enemy compound, in numbers capable of posing at least a slight threat to us, that they will be able to delay its advance, and then I will have time to pull the rabbit out of the cylinder to give the enemy a surprise at the right moment. Finished with the distribution of orders, we moved to the command post of the army in Brou, which is about 25 kilometers northwest of Chartres. Just in that forest, Willie attacked a swarm of probably the most vicious hornets in the world. The commander, the chief of staff, and his deputy, along with several soldiers, needed 25 litres of gasoline to kill the hornets. Willie felt ill, and we made him lotions of baking soda. About this time, Colonel Nixon took 3 complete sets of fuses for the far one from the trophies we captured at an airfield northwest of Orleans. On August 21, at the end of 3 weeks of hostilities, the Third Army's losses were as follows. Killed 1713, 7,928 wounded. Missing in action 1702. Non-combat losses 4,286. Total SR 15,629. Compensated losses for the same period amounted to 10,622. This was the beginning of a permanent reduction in numbers and thus a decline in the combat power of our units, caused by the lack of replenishments. The situation improved only by the middle of the battle for Bastogne. The enemy, according to our estimates, by the end of the same 3-week period, 11,000 killed, 49,000 prisoners. Wounded 48,000. Total asses 108,000. Given the experience of the Tunisia and Sicily campaigns, we knew that our estimates were quite accurate. The breakdown of equipment losses was as follows. Third Army, light tanks, 7, medium tanks, 157. Guns, 4. Enemy. Medium tanks, Nyar 269. Panther and Tiger tanks, 174. Guns, 680. While in camp, we were visited by Undersecretary of Defense Judge Robert P. Patterson and General Brigham E. Somerville, who was in charge of the transportation units. The troops were able to cross the Seine and Yonne successfully in the vicinity of Montreux and Sancerre. The 22nd Corps was not yet up to the task, as the soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 5th Division were engaged in a fierce battle with several thousand Germans at Boya. I realized at that moment that the favorable chance of winning the war was to let the Third Army advance 3 corps to the Metz-Nancy-Epinal line, where 2 of those corps would be the Shock Corps and the 3rd would be the Auxiliary Corps. I did not doubt it then, and now I did not waver in my opinion. If we did so, we would be able to cross the border with Germany in 10 days. The roads and railroads were in such condition that would have allowed us to move forward unimpeded. In Orleans, units of the 5th Infantry Division ran nose-to-nose with some Gestapo men who tried unsuccessfully to get away. They also captured a beautiful Cadillac that had been donated to 3rd Army headquarters. I flew to Bradley's headquarters to sell him my plan outlined above, but as it immediately became clear, he himself had gone to meet with General Eisenhower and Montgomery to make them a similar proposal. The only difference was that Bradley intended to carry out the operation by the 1st and 3rd Armies. The citadel at St. Malo surrendered to the 83rd Division on the 21st. This happened, it was said, through the actions of a German born in America. He was captured and sent to work in the kitchen, where he came in contact with 2 other Germans, natives of Brooklyn. He convinced them that the best way to end the war in the area was to punch a hole in the water tank, which they did. As a result, the garrison soon began to run out of water and eventually surrendered. Whether the story is true or not, I don't know, but I like it. On the morning of the 23rd, we were extremely startled by the appearance of a group of Frenchmen who had come into camp with some sort of proposal. As I thought they appeared with an offer of surrender, I agreed to talk to them. It soon became clear, however, that their purpose was to suspend hostilities to save Paris and, it seems, also the Germans. I sent the parliamentarians to General Bradley, and he immediately ordered their arrest. Immediately after their departure, my friend General Juin came to see me. He showered compliments on me, even said that I was acting in the spirit of Napoleon. But more importantly, he said that the best way to storm the Siegfried Line was through the Nancy window. I came to the same conclusion when I studied the map. It's basically very simple. I believe that if a commander sees a place through which many large roads pass, here he should attack, regardless of the resistance of the enemy. It is absolutely useless to capture any point from which you cannot move on, even if such a capture is an easily accomplished task. To assure for certain the realization of a passage through the Nancy window, it would be desirable to reinforce my army with 2 more divisions. Neither the 90th nor the 80th would arrive in time, so I tried to persuade General Bradley to allow me to take 2 divisions from the 7th Corps of the 1st Army, which I believed were in the Chartres area. After talking with Bradley, I learned that in reality the case was somewhat different and I would have to make do with what I had. Colonel Malhermotte and I went to Laval to discuss supply matters with Bradley. When we arrived, the general was waiting for us at the airfield, as he had been summoned to see General Eisenhower and Montgomery. Bradley made no secret of his concern about the latter's growing influence on the commander-in-chief, fearing that Montgomery's efforts would succeed in persuading Eisenhower to turn part, if not all, of the American armies northward. Air Marshal Sir Lee Mallory talked with Bradley almost all day, trying to convince him of the advantages of such a course of action. After Bradley got on the plane, I drove to his headquarters. In the 10 minutes it took me to get there, I came up with the most marvellous plan I had ever devised. If we divert the 3rd Army northward, we should turn the 20th Corps from Melun and Montreuil and the 12th Corps from Sancerre, then it could be done very, very quickly. First, we could move on Beauvais, picking up on the way the 4th Infantry Division of the 1st Army near Paris, then in Mantes, the 79th Division D, and perhaps also the 5th Tank Division. We could march parallel to the Seine, clearing the way for the British and Canadians, and then transfer our supplies to the other bank near Mantes. In doing so, we could dispense with half of the transports we would have needed if the crossing had been made in the Montreuil area. When I outlined my tactical idea to Bradley's Chief of Staff, General Leavency Allen, he enthusiastically supported me. We agreed that if Bradley, upon arrival, telegraphed to me Plan A, I would turn north. If he telegraphed Plan B, I would continue to advance eastward. If ever in the future the deeds of the 3rd Army and its commander become the object of study for historians, the 2 plans outlined above should certainly attract their attention. Not 2 days later, I presented to my superiors 2 possible options for the conduct of hostilities, and although one completely excluded the other, both were realistic, both feasible. Why am I saying all this? And here is the point. A person makes plans in relation to circumstances, not vice versa. It is pointless to try to cram circumstances into the framework of your plans. I suppose the ability to command armies or not to command armies lies in understanding or not understanding it. On the 23rd, the French 2nd Armoured Division and the American 4th Infantry Division entered Paris. On the 24th, the BBC announced that General Patton's Third Army had taken Paris. I saw this fact as a manifestation of the highest justice, since I could have taken the city had I not been forbidden to do so. As it turned out later, when the Second Armoured Army entered Paris, its command declared that the division belonged not to the First but to the Third Army. On August 25th, we moved the Third Army command post to a point between Orleans and Pithiviers. Even before this was accomplished, Bradley got in touch with me and asked me to come to Chartres. The cathedral, with not a single pane of glass left, was intact inside, and in my opinion looked better than ever because there was plenty of light coming in, allowing me to appreciate the architecture and decoration of the building from the inside. Monty won again, and the direction of the main thrust of our operation shifted northward. The First Army was expected to cross the Seine with 9 divisions in the vicinity of Melun and Mantes. Both of these points were seized and made suitable for the implementation of an organised crossing of the Third Army. Once on the east bank, the First Army was to march on Lille. The Third Army with 7 divisions, namely the 4th Armoured 35th and 80th Divisions in the 12th Corps, the 7th Armoured and 5th Infantry in the 20th Corps, and the 2nd French Armoured and 90th Infantry in the 15th Corps, according to Montgomery's plan, was to advance toward Metz and Strasbourg. So far, things were not so bad, because we had 7 excellent divisions, and we were going to advance in the direction that Bradley and I always wanted. Finding upon my arrival at the new command post that it was getting rather late, I decided to pay a visit to the 20th Corps, where I had not been for several days. The airman who usually drove me, the commander of the 14th Air Liaison Squadron of the Third Army, W. Bennett, was absent, and my airplane was piloted by one sergeant. It soon became clear that we were lost, but this did not prevent us from flying forward for some time until we saw a German field hospital stationed in the woods. This meant that we had crossed the front line and were about 25 kilometers away from it in the territory occupied by the enemy. Barely realizing what had happened, we gained altitude and with all haste flew in the opposite direction. On the 26th, men were sent from the Signal Corps for a day with General Patton. We went first to the location of the 20th Corps at Fontainebleau, thence through Nemours farther beyond Montreux, where we found the 5th Infantry Division. I complimented General Irwin on the fine work done by his division, and did not deny myself the pleasure of awarding Distinguished Service Crosses to several of his subordinates. When, early in the campaign, I issued an order that at least one regimental strike group must move on tank armour when marching, the 5th Division whined the loudest, saying that the guys on the tanks have nothing to hold on to which I replied that the guys have such a hard fate, although personally I never doubted. A soldier is more willing to travel 40 kilometers on anything than to pass at least 20 on foot. I remember that day Irving could not praise his mobile infantry. Usually a professional military man is stingy in his praise. We took our own tortuous path and crossed the Seine near Melun together with parts of the 3rd Armoured Division of the First Army. When the vehicle commanders recognized me, they all gave me a friendly greeting. After saying goodbye to them, I found the headquarters of the 7th Armoured Division, and in a rather harsh form expressed to the general commanding it how much dissatisfied I was with the way his unit looked and the way it was advancing. It is necessary to speak of this, as I was later obliged to remove the officer in question. I then returned to Fontainebleau and flew to the 12th Corps, stationed on the Seine-Troyes road. While I was in the location of this unit, General Wood arrived with a report that the 4th Armoured Division had just captured Troyes. This episode can rightly be called brilliant. Colonel and later General Bruce Clark sent his assault brigade to the ravine, which is 2.5 to 3 kilometers north of the city, where the soldiers successfully took cover. On the edge of Troyes, the enemy concentrated many guns and a significant number of manpower. Clark exactly hammer hit them with one tank company and 2 companies of motorized infantry on armoured personnel carriers. At the same time, the soldiers opened fire from all available guns and machine guns. Clark took the city without losing a single man or a single car. True, then we had to storm Troyes again because the Germans surrounded Clark's small detachment, but still it was a brilliantly done job. As I listed all the places I had managed to visit in one day, I marvelled at my own sagacity. Maybe someday I'll count all those kilometres I flew by airplane and rolled by car, directing the actions of the Third Army. I swear I'll count at least 1 million of them. On the 27th, the 20th Corps took Nogent and continued the advance on Reims, while the 12th Corps advanced on Chalon through Vitry. My superior officers compelled me to leave the 35th Division east of Orleans to cover my right flank, although personally I could not believe that there was a force capable of forcing the Germans across to the north bank of the Loire. I flew to Orleans, which the enemy was extremely sluggish in shelling from the opposite side of the river. The airport to the northwest of the city barely had time to receive planes that brought fuel and ammunition for our troops. The previous day it had received 600 airplanes and was going to receive the same number today. On the 28th, we took Château-Thierry and cut off Vitry-le-François, Chalon and Reims. About 10:30 General Bradley arrived. It took me a great deal of effort to persuade him to allow me to continue the offensive towards the Meuse River, but he finally gave. August 29th was, in my opinion, one of the critical days of the war. Much paper will be used later to describe it, or rather the events that made it so significant. By that time it had become clear that there was no real threat to us, at least as long as we did not allow the powerful enemy forces existing only in our imagination to stop our advance. I therefore ordered Eddy, commanding the 12th Corps, to launch an attack on Commercy and take it, and sent Walker and his 20th to Verdun with similar orders. Everything was going so that it was time to put on rose-coloured glasses, as suddenly came the news that 650 tons of fuel, which I had every reason to count on, did not come to us. At first I thought that this was a manoeuvre of the command, which had decided to slow down the advance of the Third Army, but later I learned that the delay was the result of a change in the plans of the High Command and was, I am deeply convinced, dictated by General Montgomery. On the 30th I met at Chartres with Bradley, General XR Boo AA, and also with Bradley's Chief of Staff, Allen. I outlined my considerations, explaining that I believed it was necessary to move eastward as rapidly as possible in order to break through the Siegfried Line before the Germans could gain a foothold. Bradley supported me, but as I could guess, Ball and other officers of the headquarters of the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force did not share our opinion. I am quite sure that this was the most important mistake made in the course of the war. As far as the Third Army was concerned, we were not only unable to get the tons of fuel that were due to us, we were given practically nothing else, because according to the plan to shift the direction of the main blow to the north, 2 corps of the First Army had to go there, and therefore fuel and ammunition also sailed away from us in that direction. In addition to all this, the air bridge, on which we had previously relied as the source of an appreciable portion of our supplies, had been reoriented so as to carry supplies to Paris, while other transport planes, of which I was not aware at the time, said being reserved for landing on the route of the 21st Army Group's advance. One final touch. On that very day, the Supply Department decided to move its headquarters from Cherbourg to Paris, using all the remaining trucks. On receiving this disappointing news, I went to our new command post at La Chaumière, near Sens. There I learned that Gaffey had given Eddy permission to halt the division's advance into Saint-Dizier because the tanks were almost out of fuel. I immediately telephoned Eddy and ordered to move on, to advance until the vehicles stopped, and then get out of them and stomp on foot, because the order to force the Meuse was not cancelled. In the last war I stripped 3/4 of my tanks of fuel so that 1/4 could fight, and I saw no reason why Eddy couldn't do the same. No one will ever dissuade me from believing that the halt was a pernicious mistake, for our troops should have advanced as far as the Rhine, as far as the outskirts of Worms. I could not help quoting Kipling, his poem, "If every moment with meaning, hours and days, with inexorable running," precisely to make our situation even more unenviable. General de Gaulle tried to take from us the 2nd French Armoured, which I badly needed, since the 35th Division was forced to continue inactive, covering us from the right flank. On August 31st, Bradley and I went by plane to Morlaix, which is at the northwestern tip of the Breton Peninsula. From there we went to the headquarters of the 8th Corps, and from there to the Plougastel de la Peninsula, a little south of Brest, where we met with Middleton. He had no illusions about the prospects of capturing Brest and constantly complained about the lack of morale in the infantry. Among other things, the supply department had failed to fulfill promises of ammunition. I explained to Middleton what the problem was with the infantry. They were just tired of fighting. On the way back I told Bradley that I couldn't fight indefinitely on 4 fronts, so let the 8th Corps be turned over to someone else. Bradley, as always, agreed with me. It's amazing how many times throughout the war it happened that he and I had the same thoughts in our heads. I spent the night at Bradley and Simpson's place. Simpson was to take command of the troops on the Breton Peninsula. He was expected to activate the 94th Division when it arrived here to relieve the 6th Armoured Corps. September 2, in Chartres. General Eisenhower brought to our attention with Bradley and Hodges his plan to support Montgomery, who wanted to quickly clear the Pas de Calais region from the enemy. We informed him that scouting parties of the Third Army were already operating on the Moselle River in the vicinity of Nancy, and that the 3rd Cavalry had entered the Metz area. We were still able to convince General Eisenhower to allow the 5th Corps of the 1st Army and the 3rd Army to begin the offensive on the Siegfried Line, as soon as the situation in the region of Calais stabilized. We were well aware that until then we would not be given the ammunition or fuel we needed. The general, too, liked the idea of moving the hostilities to German territory as soon as possible. Personally, I was sure that there would be no great battle if we struck in that direction immediately, as I openly stated to all assembled. Eventually, we were authorized to secure a crossing of the Moselle and prepare to attack the Siegfried Line as soon as my tanks received fuel. On the 3rd, I visited the 12th Corps, stationed at Ligny and Barras, and outlined the new plan to Eddy. It was a balm to my soul to hear that his boys had managed to seize 450 tons of aviation gasoline, and now the tanks could continue the offensive. They also got some meat at the expense of the enemy, taking almost 300 tons of it. So not only the equipment, but also the personnel had an opportunity to refuel well. Then through Commercy we drove to the 80th Division headquarters at Jaronville. Most of the towns we passed on the way lay in ruins. General McBride seemed to feel himself master of the situation, and the commander of the 1st Regiment of his division, Colonel Davidson, kept the situation under control, to the left of our forward positions and of the regimental command post. Was Monsec, Apremont, Pans, and Essy were within easy reach. These names made me mentally transported back 26 years to the past, when we had fought in these same places. Then and now we were advancing. Monsec cost us blood. I can't help it, I keep thinking about the disastrous results of our delay. The further it goes, the worse it gets. How many lives could have been saved if only we'd moved faster? Many weeks later, I returned to this theme in a conversation with Mr. Bynes, later to become U.S. Secretary of State. On the way back, we stopped to meet Colonel Clark, commander of an assault brigade of the 4th Armoured Division, and learned that he had accomplished another brilliant feat, this time at Vitry. As Clark and his men approached the town, a French civilian informed him that at the end of one of the streets was a bridge guarded by a German roadblock with 4 88mm guns standing close together. Clark hit the town with the strength of a company of light tanks, firing in all directions and pelting the enemy with hand grenades. He acted so quickly and so rapidly that literally cut off the calculations of fire and demolished the roadblock with all its guns. without losing a single unit of armoured vehicles. As the principles which formed the basis of our further advance were aptly defined by General Allen, who called them the principles of porridge from an axe, I must explain something. A vagrant once knocked at a house and asked for water to boil porridge from an axe. The curious landlady did not refuse, gave him water, in which the tramp put the axe. Then the cook asked if the hostess had any grits. He finished by asking for. In short, to be able to attack in the conditions in which we found ourselves, we had to send scouts first, and when they got into a fight, we sent reinforcements to help them. In the end, it ended up being an attack that lasted as long as we had fuel and ammunition. There was a rumour, which I hope cannot be confirmed, that some gentleman from the artillery and material department of the Third Army had managed to get some of the fuel due to its units by posing as officers of the First Army. To paraphrase a statement made about flying squadrons, we can say this: what kind of war is war when there is so much interesting stuff around? During the 4 weeks of fighting, the Third Army's losses amounted to killed, Metz 678, 12,756 wounded. Missing in action, 2474. Total combat losses, 17,908. Non-combat losses, 6,912. Total number of losses, 24,820. The number of replenishments for the given period amounted to 19,506 men, which meant the reduction of personnel by 5,000 men. According to our estimates, the enemy suffered the following losses in manpower: killed 19,000, wounded 62,000, captured 73,000, total 154,000. Material loss: Third Army, light tanks 94, medium tanks 223, artillery pieces 83, enemy, medium tanks 402, Panther and Tiger tanks 247, artillery guns 1236. When we moved our command post southeast of Chalon, we were visited by Mrs. Anna Rosenberg of the Military Mobilization and Demobilization Office. Willie seemed to take the lady's appearance in our male society a little too personally and lightly caught her leg with his teeth. She was neither frightened nor angry. September 4. We learned from Bradley that the situation in the north is more or less stabilized, which means that we are about to receive half of the due fuel and ammunition and can, forcing the Moselle, storm the Siegfried Line. We were also promised the 2nd French Armoured and 79th Infantry Divisions at once, and in addition, the 6th Armoured and 83rd Infantry later, when they will be replaced by units of the 9th Army. The return of the French 2nd and 79th meant the return to the 3rd Army of the 15th Corps, which she, to my great regret, lost after crossing the Seine. The Corps Commander, General Haslip, also arrived. We were as glad to see him as he was to see us. While awaiting the appearance of the 15th Corps east of Troyes, I had to hold the section from Neufchâteau to Nancy by the 12th Corps, and at the same time control the crossing of the Moselle near Toul and Pont-à-Mousson. As soon as the 15th Corps arrived and could engage, the 12th Corps was to move along the line from Nancy to Château-Salins. The 15th Corps was to attack as a second echelon, at the same time covering the rear of the 12th Corps from the right flank, and then cross the Moselle River, apparently in the vicinity of Chartres. The 20th Corps was to force the Moselle in the vicinity of Metz. I went to the front via Verdun and Patton, where we turned north and arrived at the headquarters of the 90th Division. We happened to be there before the division arrived. We then returned to Etienne and set course for Conflans, famous as the birthplace of the hussars of the legendary General Gerard. Conflans was now on the front line, and we held it with parts of the 2nd and 5th Infantry Divisions. At the eastern end of the town, I found an assault brigade of the 7th Armoured Division held back for more than an hour by enemy mortar and machine gun fire. Of course, such statements in the mouths of tankers at least absurd. I ordered them to immediately attack, and then went to the division commander to share my impressions of the meeting with his men. This was the second time that I personally had to push the commander of the 7th, forcing him to be more active in combat. The first time his lack of fighting qualities had been brought to my attention by General Walker while we were still at Chartres. He recommended that the commander of this division be immediately relieved of his post. So, despite my reputation as a ruthlessly breaking people's fates tank, in fact, I'm very patient. Arriving at headquarters, I learned that we are in trouble with the First Army because of the supply of fuel. We were also informed that the 12th Corps had gotten a nosedive into Pont-à-Mousson, where an attack by one of the battalions of the 5th Division had been repulsed by the enemy with great damage to ours. On the 8th I went to Ligny and Barrois to meet Eddy, after which I proceeded with him farther to the line south of Toul, where, all probability, a battle might soon break out. Eddy and I arrived at Wood's headquarters, stationed so close to the front line that we could watch the battle in progress. Shells were falling left and right of the road near where we were. I confess it was pleasant to deal with a commander who was not afraid of the front line. On the 9th, General Bradley agreed to let the 83rd Infantry and 6th Armoured begin the offensive, after which we struck up a conversation about the Brest operation. Our opinions again coincided in the main that taking Brest was now an absolutely useless endeavour. Firstly, because it is very far from the front line, and secondly, because the port is practically destroyed and neither we nor the enemy will have any use for it. On the other hand, we also agreed that if the American soldier took up the plough, he should not leave until he raises the arable land, so it was still necessary to take Brest. On the same day I visited Paris for the first time during the campaign, where I met Madame Vosy and her son, whom I had known in Burj-Bad-Vadvava 27 years before. In the afternoon, Madame V. Vaux and I went to visit General Serigny, former Chief of Staff to General Patton, with whom Serigny had broken with on account of the position which Patton had taken during the last war. An old acquaintance of mine from that old war got emotional and said that he was a great admirer of General Pershing, but that my tactics were 1,000 times better. Oh, that French courtesanship! Although, of course, modern technology allows armies to move as fast as anyone could have dreamed in Pershing's time. If he had that capability, I'm sure he would have acted swiftly. On the night of September 9, the command post of the 90th Division was attacked by the Germans, so that General Maclean was awakened by an enemy tank firing a few meters away. Fortunately for Maclean, the tankers were not aiming at him. The tank in general appeared to belong to some straggling group. They retreated, joined up with the rest of the units, and attacked again at dawn. Be that as it may, the good soldier Maclean also wasted no time, and during the second attempt the Germans left 40 tanks and 900 men dead on the field. And one of the few tanks that escaped was a Panther. I saw the track marks. The car was going straight at our guys, despite the fact that those who sat in it were well aware of how it could end. At some point they sharply turned the tank to the left, jumped out on the road leading to Germany, and, showered with our tracers, disappeared in a cloud of dust. We learned that the commander of the 15th Corps would advance along the line Chaumont, Neufchâteau-Neuville at 8.0 on the 11th. Having fought hard east of the river and south of Nancy, the 12th Corps still continued to advance. A strange feature of this crossing was the fact that while one regiment met heavy resistance and suffered heavy casualties, the other regiment on its right met no resistance and suffered no casualties. If we were fighting according to a textbook, we should, in accordance with the recommendations of the authors, have withdrawn our troops from an area where the enemy was offering stubborn resistance to one where there was little resistance. But no textbook can ever take into account how difficult it is to regroup forces during a night attack, and moreover, how dangerous it is to stop it once it has begun. Some infantry of the 20th Corps was crossing south of Metz, and the 90th Division was breaking through in the direction of the river from Metz to Thionville. On the 10th, units of the 2nd French Armoured Division of the 15th Corps came into contact with units of the 1st French Infantry Division of the 7th Army in the vicinity of Saint-Benoît, flying over French territory. I never ceased to be amazed at the amount of effort that went into erecting various defences and digging trenches during both that and this war. To a pacifist, the view from the porthole of my airplane would have given him the brilliant idea of issuing an angry denunciation against the ills of society and the horrors of war. But he could not have found a better argument against himself by looking at the cemeteries, where every little white cross speaks of human stupidity, which will inevitably lead to more and more wars. To the 20,000 Germans who surrendered to 9th Army units on the 11th, asked for special mention that they surrendered to the 3rd Army and the 19th Tactical Air Brigade, not to the 9th Army. On the 12th we arranged a supply meeting at the 12th Army Group headquarters. Since Colonel R.W. Wilson, Chief of Supply of the 1st Army, was there, I had to watch carefully what I said. He had previously been my 2nd Corps Chief of Supplies. We learned that Montgomery had explained to Eisenhower that the delay in the advance of the 7th Corps was due to a shortage of fuel, but the reality was otherwise. Simply, Monty again tried to concentrate all Allied forces in the north to strike in the direction of the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, as well as the Ruhr. If the Supreme Commander succumbed to Monty's stratagem, the 3rd Army would have to switch on the Moselle River from offensive to defence and, moreover, send the 20th Corps to Luxembourg. In any event, I felt that only the speedy completion of the crossing of this water obstacle could prevent little unpleasant consequences, and by the night of the 14th Bradley authorised me to proceed. Had I not by that time secured a strong bridgehead on the opposite bank, I would have had to content myself, mired in positional warfare, with the sad role of defender. General Hughes presented me with a brand new .38, caliber pistol with a mother-of-pearl grip and a new winter coat. I was touched by his concern. He and I tried to visit the 15th Corps, but due to a mistake, we could only get to the rear echelon. Bennett and 2 airplanes picked us up from a gentle hillside where cows were peacefully grazing. How we took off, I don't know, but somehow we did. The next day Hughes and I went to the 12th Corps, but it turned out that Eddy had left at dawn to the 80th Division, which was subjected to a powerful counterattack by the enemy south of Pont-à-Mousson. The Germans still managed to capture the bridge, but to their misfortune, the ubiquitous Colonel Bruce Clark and his 4th Armoured Assault Brigade arrived there and drove the Germans away. The 5th Division 2nd Infantry Regiment and 1 assault brigade of the 7th Armoured were also thrown off by an enemy counterattack from the heights northwest of Metz. But against all odds, the 35th Division, together with an assault brigade of the 4th Armoured under the command of Brig. General X. Edija safely crossed the water barrier south of Metz and advanced on Luneville. The 5th Division, excluding the 2nd Infantry Regiment, had also crossed to the other side of the Moselle River south of Metz. During our tour, Hughes and I had the opportunity to observe a magnificent tank battle from a distance of 1.5 kilometers. Since we were in a plum orchard, we were able to combine the pleasant with the useful. 2 German tanks were blazing merrily in front of us, and 3 of ours a little farther away from them were dealing with a forest belt that blocked their way. We saw the flashes of bursting shells and distinguished our machine guns from the German ones by the sound. The latter had a noticeably higher rate of fire. After watching the battle, we drove to the headquarters of the 15th Corps, which we never found last time. The Corps units had done excellent work, taking Neufchâteau and bypassing Charmont. They also secured for us a crossing of the Moselle near Charmes. That same evening we were visited by Archbishop Stellman. By the evening of the 14th I had kept my promise to Bradley, and, in both his and my opinion, had secured a firm bridgehead on the east bank of the Moselle River. I felt empowered to continue pushing the boundaries of the enemy-cleared areas farther toward Germany. We moved to a new command post 8 kilometers south of Atin, which was a supply centre for the German army during the Verdun operation during World War I. So then the city and its surroundings were subjected to heavy artillery fire. In fact, Atin was almost completely rebuilt in 1921 with funds provided by America. On the way to the command post, I stopped and had lunch with Generals Bradley and Bull. Bradley was very upset because, as I suspected, Montgomery had once again succeeded, and he had succeeded in persuading the Commander-in-Chief to transfer all supply resources to the First Army, leaving the Third Army on the defensive. Bradley resisted in spite of everything, as he saw that the Third Army could and should have continued the offensive. Even more distressing was the news that 1-2 Division Corps from the 12th Army Group was being diverted to the 7th Army, which was actually one corps at that point. Simpson was then to receive 7 divisions from the 9th Army, and the 1st and 3rd Armies were to increase their divisions to 9 infantry and 3 armoured divisions each. Then I, still optimistic, thought that the war would be over before we got all these units. In fact, it turned out that during the Operation Bulge under my command was 17 divisions, in May 1945. 18? While we were talking came the happy news that Nancy fell and the 15th Corps defeated the 16th German Infantry Division and also destroyed 60 tanks. Just at the moment when these tanks hit the right flank of the 12th Corps to thwart the German tank counterattack. The 15th Corps forded the Moselle River near Chartres and fortunately made it in time. Since the command post was at Etaine, I could not deny myself the pleasure of viewing the battlefield of Verdun and especially Fort Douaumont. It appeared to me to be a magnificent monument of useless heroism. Everywhere there were traces of former battles, ruined buildings and fortifications on which brave men had died in defence. They would have died much less if they had attacked instead of repelling the onslaught. To me, Douaumont is a small but vivid example of how ridiculous defensive strategy is. It became obvious that there was an opportunity to make a breakthrough in the area where the 12th Corps was operating, and, taking into account the circumstances, I decided to give the 12th Corps 7th tank, entrusting Metz in the care of the 20th Corps with its 83rd, 90th and 5th Divisions. Meanwhile, the 12th Corps with its 7th, 6th and 4th Armoured, and with the 35th and 80th Infantry Divisions, was to make a vigorous offensive eastward toward the Rhine. The next day we were visited by a delegation of Russians, whom I avoided meeting by leaving for the front line. However, I repaid them for their treatment of our observers by giving them a map of the chief of my reconnaissance, by which it was simply impossible to understand what was happening and where. On my arrival at the 12th Corps, I found General Eddy in a state of extreme agitation. I advised him to go to bed early with a good nightcap of whisky or brandy, as I wanted to see him in good health for the rush to the Siegfried Line. My hopes were overflowing. I could already see myself crossing the Rhine. I even advised Eddy, after his columns had broken through the Siegfried Line, to send forward tank units and motorized infantry to take the bridge at Worms, while he himself with the rest of the units would have to expand the gap in the enemy's defence and clear the territory between the Saar and Moselle rivers from the enemy. The best laid plans of men and mice go down. On my way to the 12th Corps locations, I passed through Toul, Pan and Essy, towns where I had lived and fought 26 years before. Much was the same as I remembered, but the wall behind which I was behind, directing the actions of the attackers, was no longer of stone as it had been then, but of cement. I guess they had just built a new one here. Anyway, I made a trip back to that distant day of September 12, 1918. The French again tried to rake their 2nd Armoured Division under them, but Haslip, the commander of the corps it was part of, successfully repelled their attempts. Losses on September 17. 3rd Army. Killed 3,841. Wounded 8,441. Missing in action 4,120. Total 26,402. Enemy. Killed 26,000. Wounded U 73,000. Captured Kurt 87,000. Total 186,000. Material losses. 3rd Army. Light tanks 121. Medium tanks 264. Artillery guns 99. Enemy. Medium tanks, 542. Panther and Tiger tanks, 377. Artillery guns, 1596. On contact, Bradley reported that Monty wanted all American units to stop so that he, Monty, would have the opportunity to deliver a dagger blow into the heart of Germany with the strength of the 21st Army Group. Bradley, however, noted that Monty's dagger blow could easily turn out to be a table knife strike. It was becoming quite obvious that, in order to avoid the dangerous consequences of the impending decision of the General Command, the Third Army must develop its successes with all possible speed. In short, I asked Bradley not to get in touch with me before dark on the 19th. On the 18th, I awarded General Leclerc the Silver Star, and also presented him with 6 Silver Stars and 25 Bronze Stars to be awarded to distinguished soldiers of his division. Just then, word came from Venard Wilson's 106th Cavalry Brigade. The German infantry was advancing in 2 columns toward Luneville from Baccarat. I ordered Haslip to attack the enemy immediately. Haslip immediately rushed to give out orders, and as Wyke was on the spot, things spun up literally instantaneously. I then went to Nancy to meet Eddie, whom I found in a cheerful frame of mind, busy giving out orders. He had sent Assault Brigade B of the 6th Armoured, which had reached Toul, to Luneville to stop the Germans. I remained confident that the 12th Corps' advance on the Siegfried Line should continue despite the breakthrough in the Luneville area, and it was with great satisfaction that I learned that the 12th and 20th Corps had come into contact north of Pont-à-Mousson. Studying the new reports on the state of the enemy defences on the Siegfried Line, looking at the maps of sappers and scouts, I was once again convinced that before, guided by the map of roads, made the right calculation, correctly selected 2 places as possible points for the implementation of the breakthrough. The 19th did not live up to expectations, did not become the day of which I dreamed. The enemy had forced the 35th Division to abandon the high ground northeast of Nancy and now had the opportunity to shell the city. The 4th Panzer Division was subjected to the strongest counterattack of the Germans, and parts of the 15th Corps failed to reach Luneville. To cheer up the despondent Eddie, I reminded him of the words that Grant once said, and other words that belonged to Lee. The former had said, "In every battle there comes a moment when both sides consider themselves defeated. He who attacks wins," and the latter is believed to have uttered after Chancellorsville the following: "I didn't have the strength to defend, so I had to attack. It worked. Eddie immediately took the high ground from the Germans. Then both he and I headed for Wood. We found him with Bruce Clark, whose assault brigade had just taken out 20 enemy tanks. After crossing the Moselle, Clark's boys destroyed 700 enemy soldiers and officers, and 1,400 were taken prisoner, as well as disabling 70 tanks and 27 artillery pieces. I saw that the division had greatly stretched its orders, but still believed that the attack should continue. As I believed offensive action was always the most correct tactic against the Germans, for while you are attacking a German, he has no time to think of how to strike at you. While at Bradley's headquarters on the 20th, I saw a map. On it was plotted the direction of attack which Bradley and I had thought most correct from the beginning. According to the plan, we were to advance rapidly with 2 corps, while the 3rd was to move in the 2nd echelon in rear of the 1st, to the right of the main line of attack. Nancy, Chateau, Salins-Sarrazmin, Mainz or Worms, and on to the northeast of Frankfurt. It was obvious that to the Third Army should have been added at least 2 infantry divisions, retaining the 4 existing armoured divisions. I had no doubt at the time that there were no other German units in front of us, except for those we had already fought, and then received a firm confirmation of this. In other words, they had no echelon defences. Just that day, I finally decided that it was inexpedient to storm Metz. It was necessary to leave a small force in order to block it, to develop the offensive to the banks of the Rhine. On the 21st, everything was in order with the offensive, but one of my staff officers, who was in the 6th Army group of general divers, heard him talking about how he was going to take some of my units. So I flew to Paris to General Eisenhower to prevent this from happening. As events have shown, my trip was completely useless, but at that moment it seemed right to me to preempt the actions of divas. The next day Codman and Stiller and I visited the 90th Division and the 358th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Christian Clark, who was in 1936 adjutant to General Drum. We then travelled with Colonel Polk of the 3rd Cavalry Brigade to the farthest left edge of our unit locations, where we found ourselves between the line of our troops and the Germans. On that trip, we passed a group of unarmed and totally undisciplined French soldiers whose main concern was to fill their bellies at the American camp kitchen. I decided that such soldiers must be gotten rid of, and the sooner the better. September 23rd was the most disgusting day of my years in the army. I received a call from Bradley, who said that in accordance with the decision of the top leadership I have to abandon the 6th Armoured Division and due to lack of fuel and ammunition to move from the offensive to the defence. General Divers told General Eisenhower that on October 1 he needed the 15th Corps, the supply of which he could establish through Dijon. As Bradley and I had foreseen, Divers got his way. When I complained to General Gay in conversation, he asked, "What is a victory worth?" wanting to say that in Morocco and Tunisia and Sicily, and here in France we had won. But the fruits of our victories were invariably squandered, somehow or other. I consoled myself with the fact that whenever I had to experience the greatest disappointment in life, it was always to my advantage. That's what happened now, although I didn't know it at the time and was greatly distressed. On the 24th Gaffey, Maddoxy and I met with the commanders of the 3 corps, Eddy, Haslip and Walker, in Nancy, where we agreed that we would continue to develop the offensive east of the Moselle River. We also outlined the points at which we would proceed on the principle of porridge from the axe, so that we would, without ceasing to hope for the best, be ready to cut the ribbon and rush forward when we could. General Haslip was very reluctant to leave the Third Army, and we and the whole Third Army were reluctant to let him go. On the 24th, I noted another fine example of the interaction of ground and air units. 5 tanks from the 4th Armoured were attacked by no less than 5 times as many enemy armoured units as they were. We could only assist them from the air. Although by all accounts the weather was bad, General Wayland ordered 2 squadrons to take off. They took off and, using radar, swept only a few meters above the ground. Detecting the enemy, the pilots dropped time bombs and fired machine guns and cannons. Attacking the enemy, the pilots did not even know whether they would be able to land after the raid was over, but they did their job perfectly. Having bombed, they flew deep into France, and as soon as they found a gap in the clouds, went for a landing and landed safely. One of the officers bore the last name of Cole, and I later heard that he was awarded the Medal of Honor. He deserved the award.